The gunshot echoed through the frozen streets of Cedar Ridge just as Jacob Morrison reached for the last sack of flour on Samuel Mitchell's counter. Blood splattered across the burlap as a body crashed through the mercantile's front window, sending glass shards cascading onto the wooden planks like deadly snow. Jake instinctively dove behind the counter, his weathered hands clutching the precious flour to his chest while chaos erupted around him. Through the settling dust and screams, he glimpsed a slender figure in tattered silk moving with impossible grace between the overturned barrels and scattered goods. The woman's black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her dark eyes held a fierce intelligence that seemed oddly calm amid the violence. She pressed herself against the far wall, breathing heavily but making no sound, as if she had learned long ago that survival depended on invisibility. The saloon doors across the street burst open, and 3 men stumbled out, their faces flushed with whiskey and rage. The largest one, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, bellowed into the crisp morning air. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and his words sent ice through Jake's veins. "Where is she, Mitchell? That yellow whore owes me money, and I aim to collect one way or another." Samuel Mitchell emerged from behind his counter, his hands raised in surrender, his usually confident demeanor reduced to trembling fear. The shopkeeper's eyes darted nervously between the broken window and the woman still pressed against his back wall. Jake could see the man's internal struggle, the way his fingers twitched as he weighed his options between profit and conscience. "Now, Briggs, I don't know nothing about no woman. This here's a respectable establishment." The giant named Briggs stepped closer, his boots crunching on the broken glass. Jake noticed the way the man's hand rested casually on his gun handle, the practiced ease of someone who solved problems with violence. The 2 men flanking him spread out slightly, a coordinated movement that spoke of experience in intimidation. "Don't play games with me, old man. She came through here not 10 minutes ago, and somebody saw her duck into your store. Now you can tell me where she's hiding, or I can start tearing this place apart board by board." Jake's eyes found the woman again, and this time she was looking directly at him. Her gaze held no plea for help, no desperate appeal for rescue. Instead, there was something calculating in her expression, as if she was measuring him, weighing possibilities he couldn't yet understand. When she moved, it was with deliberate purpose, stepping away from the wall despite the obvious danger. "I am here." Her voice cut through the tension like a blade, clear and unafraid despite her obvious exhaustion. She stood in full view now, her chin raised in defiance, though Jake could see the slight tremor in her hands. The silk dress she wore had once been beautiful, but now it hung in tatters, stained with mud and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. Briggs turned toward her with the slow, predatory movement of a wolf that had cornered its prey. His smile revealed teeth stained brown with tobacco, and there was something in his eyes that made Jake's stomach turn. This was not merely about money, Jake realized. This was about power, about possession, about reducing another human being to property. "There's my little bird. You've led me quite a chase, Lee May. Cost me time, cost me men, and time is money in my business." Lee May straightened her shoulders, and Jake was struck by the dignity she maintained even in her desperate circumstances. When she spoke, her English was precise, colored with an accent that suggested education far beyond what most people in Cedar Ridge possessed. "I owe you nothing, Briggs. The debt died with Chen Wei, and you know this." The giant's laugh was harsh and without humor. He took another step closer, and Jake could see Lee May's jaw tighten, though she held her ground. The other 2 men moved to block the doorway, cutting off any escape route. "See, that's where you're wrong, girl. When Chen Wei died owing me $300, his property became mine. And you, sweet thing, you were his most valuable property." Jake felt something hot and dangerous rise in his chest. He had seen enough cruelty in his 32 years, had witnessed enough suffering during his time fighting in the Indian Wars, to recognize evil when it stood before him. This man spoke of another human being as if she were livestock, and the casual way he did it suggested this was not his first such transaction. Lee May's response surprised everyone in the room. Instead of cowering or pleading, she laughed. It was a sound like silver bells, incongruous in the tense atmosphere, and it clearly unsettled Briggs. The giant's confident smirk faltered, replaced by something uglier. You think this is amusing? I think you are a fool if you believe Chinwei owned me. I belonged to myself then, as I do now. The slap came fast and hard, the sound echoing through the store like another gunshot. Li Mei staggered but remained standing, a thin line of blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his own gun, but he forced himself to remain still. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and any rash action would likely result in more bloodshed. Briggs grabbed Li Mei's wrist, his massive hand easily encircling the delicate bone. Jake could see the pain flash across her face, though she made no sound. The man's voice dropped to a whisper, but in the silence of the store, his words carried clearly. You're coming back to San Francisco with me, girl. And this time, you're going to be a lot more cooperative about earning back what's owed. It was then that Li Mei's eyes found Jake again, and this time there was something different in her gaze. Not desperation, but calculation. Not surrender, but strategy. When she spoke, her words were directed at Jake, though she continued to stare at Briggs. Don't buy food, buy me, farmer. I'll be yours forever. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Jake felt his world shift, understanding flooding through him even as confusion clouded his thoughts. She was offering herself to him, but not in the way Briggs intended to claim her. She was offering a bargain, a transaction that would remove her from one man's power and place her under another's protection. Briggs's head snapped toward Jake, his eyes narrowing as he took in the tall, lean farmer for the first time. Jake could feel the weight of that scrutiny, could sense the man evaluating him as a potential threat or obstacle. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and danger. This doesn't concern you, farmer. Jake stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, but his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had faced death and survived. He had learned in the war that sometimes the most dangerous men were those who spoke softly. Actually, it does now. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the small roll of bills that represented his last savings, the money he had planned to use for seed and supplies to see his failing ranch through another brutal winter. Without breaking eye contact with Briggs, he counted out $50 and placed it on the counter. I'll take the woman. Li Mei's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the store. Jake could see surprise flicker across her features, followed quickly by something that might have been hope. But it was Briggs's reaction that concerned him most. The giant's face had darkened with rage, and his hand had moved closer to his gun. She owes $300, farmer. You looking to pay full price? Jake's mind raced. $300 was more than his ranch was worth, more than he could earn in 2 good years. But looking at Li Mei, seeing the way she held herself despite her fear, seeing the intelligence in her eyes and the strength in her bearing, he found himself making a decision that defied all logic. I don't have $300 in cash, but I have something better. He pulled a folded paper from his inner pocket, the deed to his ranch that he had brought to town as collateral for a loan he now realized he would never need. The land was good, despite the recent drought, and it bordered the creek that had made his property valuable before the mining boom went bust. 160 acres of prime grazing land, with water rights and a solid house. Worth $500 easy, if you know how to work it. Briggs examined the deed with the careful attention of a man who understood that value could take many forms. Jake could see him calculating, weighing the certainty of owning land against the uncertainty of tracking down a woman who had already proven difficult to control. You're willing to trade your ranch for a Chinese whore? The words were meant to provoke, to make Jake reconsider, but they had the opposite effect. Jake looked at Li Mei again, saw the way she flinched at the crude language, saw the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Whatever her story, whatever had brought her to this moment, she deserved better than to be spoken of like an animal. I'm willing to trade my ranch for another human being's freedom. Li Mei stared at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was gratitude there, but also something deeper, more complex. She understood, perhaps better than he did, the full implications of what was happening. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. Are you certain, farmer? This is not a small thing you offer. Jake nodded, though his heart was pounding with the magnitude of his decision. He was trading away everything he had worked for, everything that connected him to his past and his dead wife's memory. But looking at this woman, seeing the courage it had taken for her to speak up in the first place, he knew he could not walk away. "I'm certain." Briggs snatched the deed from Jake's hands and studied it more carefully, his eyes moving over the legal language with surprising literacy. After several long minutes, he folded the paper and tucked it into his coat pocket. When he looked up, his expression had shifted from anger to businesslike calculation. "Deal. But understand this, farmer. If she runs, if she causes me trouble, if I don't get full value from this arrangement, I'll be back for both of you." With that, Briggs and his men left as abruptly as they had arrived, their boots crunching over the broken glass as they headed back toward the saloon. The sudden silence felt almost as oppressive as the previous tension. Jake found himself alone with Lee May and Samuel Mitchell, none of them quite sure what came next. Lee May approached Jake slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. When she was close enough to touch, she stopped and studied his face with the same calculating gaze she had used earlier. Finally, she extended her hand in a gesture that seemed oddly formal given the circumstances. "My name is Lee May Chin. I am 24 years old, and until this moment, I have never owed my life to a stranger." Jake took her hand gently, surprised by the calluses on her palms that spoke of hard work despite her refined appearance. Her grip was firm, and her eyes never left his face as they shook hands like business partners sealing a deal. "Jacob Morrison. Most folks call me Jake. And you don't owe me anything, Miss Chen. Nobody should be bought and sold like cattle." Something shifted in her expression, a softening that made her look younger and more vulnerable. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of experiences he could only imagine. "You do not know what you have done, Jake Morrison. You do not know what kind of trouble you have purchased along with me." Jake looked out through the broken window at the gray December sky, heavy with the promise of snow. His ranch was gone, his savings were depleted, and winter was coming fast. He had just tied his fate to a woman he knew nothing about, a woman who came with enemies and secrets he couldn't begin to understand. But when he looked back at Lee May, saw the way the morning light caught the gold flecks in her dark eyes, saw the strength in her shoulders despite her exhaustion, he found that he didn't regret his decision. There was something about her that called to the part of him that had been dead since his wife's passing, something that suggested redemption might be possible even for a failed farmer with nothing left to lose. "Then I guess we'll figure it out together." Lee May smiled for the first time since he had seen her, and Jake was struck by how it transformed her entire face. The fear and calculation were still there, but underneath them was something else, something that might have been the beginning of trust. "Together," she repeated, as if testing the word in her mouth. "Yes, perhaps that is possible." The ride to Jake's ranch took 3 hours through terrain that grew more desolate with each mile. Lee May rode behind him on his old mare, her arms wrapped around his waist for warmth as the December wind cut through their clothes like knives. She had said little since leaving town, but Jake could feel the tension in her body, the way she constantly looked over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit. When they finally reached the small log cabin nestled against a stand of pine trees, Lee May dismounted and stood perfectly still, surveying the property with those calculating eyes. Jake watched her take in the modest house, the empty corral, the tool shed that leaned precariously to one side. Everything about the place spoke of a man barely hanging on, and he felt a flush of shame at bringing her to such humble surroundings. "It's not much," he said, leading the horse toward the small barn. Lee May walked to the cabin's front door and ran her fingers along the wood frame, examining it with the attention of someone who understood construction. When she turned back to him, her expression was unreadable. "You traded this for me. Why?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Jake had been asking himself the same thing during the cold ride home, and he still didn't have a good answer. Something about seeing Briggs treat her like property had ignited a rage in him that he thought had died with his wife. Because it was the right thing to do. Lee May studied his face for a long moment, then nodded as if he had passed some invisible test. She followed him inside the cabin, where the cold air felt only marginally warmer than outside. Jake quickly built up the fire while Lee May explored the small space with careful steps. "Your wife," she said, stopping before a small daguerreotype on the mantel. She was beautiful. Jake's hand stilled on the kindling. He hadn't expected her to notice Sarah's picture so quickly, and the casual way she mentioned his dead wife sent an unexpected jolt through him. "How did you know I was married?" Li Mei turned from the photograph, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked almost apologetic. A man does not live alone in a place like this unless he has lost someone. The way you keep house, the care you take with small things, the sadness that follows you like a shadow. These are the signs of a widower. The accuracy of her observation unsettled him. Jake had thought he had learned to hide his grief better, but this woman seemed to see through him with disturbing clarity. He finished lighting the fire and stood, wiping his hands on his pants. "Sarah died 2 winters ago. Fever took her when the snows came early and I couldn't get her to the doctor in time." Li Mei moved closer to the fire, extending her hands toward the growing warmth. In the flickering light, Jake could see that her silk dress was not just torn but carefully mended in several places, as if she had been wearing it for weeks. "And you have blamed yourself ever since." It wasn't a question, and the certainty in her voice made him turn away. Jake busied himself preparing coffee, but her words had found their mark. The guilt he carried was like a stone in his chest, growing heavier with each passing day. "I should have seen the signs earlier. Should have taken her to town before the storm hit. And if you had left earlier, perhaps you would have both died on the trail. Perhaps the fever would have taken her regardless. Perhaps there are some things that cannot be changed by wishing." Jake looked at her sharply, surprised by the gentleness in her tone. Li Mei was watching him with an expression that held understanding rather than pity, as if she too carried the weight of irreversible decisions. "You sound like someone who knows about regret." Li Mei's smile was sad and knowing. She moved to the small table and sat down, her movements graceful despite her obvious exhaustion. "I know about choices that cannot be undone. About prices that must be paid for survival." Jake poured the coffee and joined her at the table, noting the way she wrapped her hands around the warm cup as if it were precious. Outside, the wind was picking up, and he could hear the first whispers of snow against the windows. "What happened in San Francisco, Li Mei? Who was Chen Wei?" Her hands tightened on the coffee cup, and for a moment Jake thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Chen Wei was my husband, but not by choice. My father sold me to him when I was 16 to pay his gambling debts. Wei was not a cruel man, but he was weak, and his weakness made him dangerous to know." Jake waited, sensing there was more to the story. Li Mei stared into her coffee as if reading the future in its dark surface. "Wei borrowed money from Briggs to start a business importing goods from China. When the business failed, Wei could not repay the debt. So he offered Briggs something else as collateral. You." Li Mei nodded, her jaw tight with remembered anger. "When Wei died of pneumonia last month, Briggs came to collect what he considered his property. But I had already taken what money remained and fled." Jake leaned back in his chair, beginning to understand the depth of the trouble he had bought along with Li Mei's freedom. Briggs wasn't just a local thug. He was connected to networks that stretched back to the biggest cities in California, networks that didn't forgive debts or tolerate theft. "How much money did you take?" Li Mei's eyes met his, and he saw both defiance and fear in their depths. "All of it. Every dollar Wei had hidden away, every piece of silver, every valuable thing in that miserable house. Nearly $800. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. $800 was a fortune, more money than most men in Cedar Ridge would see in 5 years. If Briggs discovered that Li Mei had that money, the ranch deed would seem like a consolation prize. "Do you still have it?" Li Mei stood and walked to the window, peering out at the gathering darkness. Snow was falling more heavily now, and Jake could see her shiver despite the fire's warmth. "Hidden where only I can find it. But Briggs suspects, I think. He knows I am too smart to run with empty pockets." Jake joined her at the window, watching the snow erase the tracks their horse had left. Soon there would be no evidence of their passage, but he doubted that would stop men like Briggs for long. "He'll come looking for you." "Yes. But not tonight, and perhaps not for several days if this storm is as bad as it appears." Winter has always been my ally. Jake looked at her profile in the lamplight, noting the determined set of her jaw and the way her eyes never stopped moving, never stopped calculating. This woman had survived things that would have broken weaker people, and she was already planning their next move while he was still trying to understand what they faced. What do we do when spring comes? Lee May turned from the window and faced him directly. In her eyes, Jake saw something that made his breath catch. Not just intelligence or determination, but a fierce protectiveness that seemed to include him in its scope. By spring, Mr. Morrison, either we will be strong enough to face whatever comes for us, or we will be dead. But we will not run, and we will not hide. She moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of jasmine that somehow still clung to her despite everything she had endured. When she placed her hand on his arm, her touch was warm and sure. You saved my life today, but I think perhaps I can save yours as well. If you will let me. Jake looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up into her eyes. Outside, the storm was building into something that would keep the whole territory locked in ice for weeks. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and he realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, he didn't feel entirely alone. I reckon we'll find out together. Lee May smiled, and Jake noticed that this time there was no calculation behind it, no hidden agenda. For just a moment, she looked like what she was, a young woman who had found unexpected shelter in the middle of a blizzard. But as the wind howled around the cabin and the snow piled deeper against the windows, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm was still coming. And when it arrived, it would test everything they thought they knew about survival, about trust, and about the price of the choices they had made in a broken-down mercantile on a cold December morning.